Welcome to the third lecture on Henry VII's foreign policy. Today we are going to examine how successful Henry VII was at managing trade deals with other nations. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will examine England's position in relation to other trading nations and the significance of the cloth or wool trade. Secondly, we will examine Magnus Intercursus, which was the good trade deal made with Burgundy. Then we will examine the Treaty of Windsor, otherwise known as Malus Intercursus, which was a bad trade deal with Burgundy. Finally, we will evaluate the extent to which Henry was able to meet his key aims of security and prestige through treaties with other countries. We will finally evaluate Henry's participation in New World exploration compared to other nations. Wool had been England's main export throughout the medieval age, comprising up to 90% of all exports out of England. Most traders operated out of the docks in London, but there were some trade ports on the south coast, such as Portsmouth and Southampton. This is a map to show all major trade routes of the late 15th century. As you can see, the majority of trade across Europe took place by shipping routes, especially across the North, Baltic and Mediterranean seas. Compared to other European nations, England was unfortunately quite far behind in establishing profitable trade routes. The Republic of Venice was the most powerful trading nation in Europe. Though operating out of a small region that surrounds Venice in northern Italy, the routes stretched westwards to Cadiz in Spain, Lisbon in Portugal, and then northwards to London. Eastwards, they also traded out of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, which was the gateway to Asia Minor. The Hanseatic League were a league of German merchants who operated out of various northern and central European port cities, such as Hamburg, Lübeck and Danzig. They had become increasingly more powerful throughout the medieval age so that they dominated trade in the North and Baltic seas. Since England had been engaged in a civil war for 50 years, they had not been able to compete with the Hanseatic League in terms of trade, leaving them at a disadvantage. Henry very much wanted to change this. Henry VII prioritized trade at the very start of his reign with 2 Acts of Parliament called the Navigation Acts in 1485 and 1486. These were designed to give English merchants an advantage in trade. As a result, only English ships could import or export goods from England. Foreign ships could only be used if an English ship was unavailable. A ship was defined as English if 50% of the crew were English. This was designed to break the monopoly of the Hanseatic League, who dominated trade in the North Sea, since before 1485 most English merchants had to rely on the Hanseatic League to ship their goods. As a result of the Navigation Acts, Henry upset the powerful Hanseatic League. As a result, Henry instructed that merchants should build their ships to weigh at least 8 tons. This meant they could convert to naval ships if necessary. This was a savvy move since Henry could not afford a standing navy. Overall, the Navigation Acts did help to boost trade after the 50 years of civil war, but Henry's success was never so great as to rival the Hanseatic League. England's main trading partner was Burgundy, specifically through the Flanders port of Antwerp. England's main export was wool, which had traditionally been exported through the port of Calais and then turned into finished cloth before being sold by continental merchants. However, by 1485, a new company called the Merchant Adventurers were beginning to trade in finished cloth, as this proved more profitable, and their main trading partners were the Flemish merchants operating out of Antwerp. However, in 1493 Henry imposed a trade embargo on Burgundy. This is because Margaret, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, was harbouring Perkin Warbeck and pretending that he was her nephew Richard of York. In retaliation, Henry imposed a trade embargo on Burgundy. This was designed to place economic pressure on Margaret's step-grandson Philip, Duke of Burgundy. However, it did not please the merchant adventurers, who had to relocate to Calais. This shows that Henry was willing to sacrifice trade, in particular the cloth trade, for the sake of dynastic security. It also shows that even though wool was England's main export, it did not constitute a large portion of the economy as a whole, certainly not as important as crop farming. The trade embargo against Burgundy lasted for 3 years. Philip of Burgundy finally accepted that the harm the embargo had on Flemish merchants was serious enough to abandon his support of Perkin Warbeck, much to his step-grandmother's displeasure. The embargo ended with a trade agreement in 1496 that has retrospectively been dubbed the Magnus Intercursus, meaning the Great Treaty. It established a strong reciprocal relationship between English and Flemish merchants, which benefited both sides, with affordable rates of tax. The Magnus Intercursus held strong for a decade until 1506. Then an unforeseen event provided Henry with the opportunity to change the trade deal to something more advantageous to English merchants. Philip of Burgundy was sailing to Spain with his wife Joanna of Castile. They were in a hurry since Joanna was looking to stake her claim as Queen of Castile, following the death of her mother Isabella. The pair were willing to fight for Joanna's claim against her father, Ferdinand of Aragon. Henry hosted Philip and Joanna at Windsor for 6 weeks while their boat was being repaired. During this time, Henry manipulated the young Duke of Burgundy to accept a new trade deal, one that was more advantageous to English merchants than it was to the Flemish. In addition, he made Philip agree to the extradition of Edmund de la Pole, the last Yorkist claimant, from the court of his father Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. Philip felt he had little choice but to accept the deal since the shipwreck had delayed his journey long enough. However, it proved deeply unpopular with Flemish merchants, who were then reluctant to engage in trade with the merchant adventurers of London. This shows that a trade deal has to work on both sides to be of true benefit. It is also an example of Henry's greedy obsession for financial security in the final years of his reign. The trade deal was called the Treaty of Windsor, but it became known as the Malus Intercursus, in other words the Bad Treaty. The Malus Intercursus was very short-lived. Philip of Burgundy died suddenly, apparently of typhoid fever, and so the new treaty was never ratified. The old terms of Magnus Intercursus therefore resumed. As to poor Joanna, she apparently fell into madness, believing her husband had been poisoned. Her father Ferdinand confined her to a convent and took full control of Castile. However, Philip and Joanna did leave behind a legacy. During their short marriage, they had 4 daughters and 2 sons that survived to adulthood. They become the next kings, emperors, and queens of Europe, most notably their eldest son Charles. The Habsburg dynasty was born. Let's now examine New World exploration, since it was in the latter half of Henry's reign that European explorers, including Christopher Columbus, discovered the New World. This is a map of the world from 1467, before Henry's reign. As you can see, there is no knowledge of the Americas or Australasia. Europe is mostly accurate since cartographers could easily document the different areas of land mass. But Africa's landmass is woefully inaccurate. In contrast, this is a map from 1508, at the end of Henry's reign. The New World now appears on the map. There's an understanding of North and South America, plus the Caribbean islands, but this is not mapped or scaled accurately, and the Atlantic Ocean is too narrow. Spain and Portugal were the first two nations to invest in New World exploration. Christopher Columbus was Italian, but his voyages were funded by Spain. He made 4 transatlantic voyages between 1492 and 1504. His main destination was the Caribbean, including the Bahamas, Cuba, and Jamaica. In his final 2 voyages he also traveled to Caracas in modern-day Venezuela and Panama in Central America. Henry was not interested in competing with Spain for land in the New World. The first explorations were always a risk. The explorers may not find any suitable land, or worse still become shipwrecked in the vast ocean, never to return. However, he was interested in discovering new fisheries since the Hanseatic League was blocking access to the Icelandic fishing grounds for English fishermen. Therefore, instead of following Spain to the Caribbean, Henry went northwards in search of new fisheries. Henry employed an Italian navigator and explorer called Cabot to complete 2 voyages. These voyages began in Bristol, which had a strong fishing industry. Cabot's first voyage in 1497 was a success. Cabot discovered a newly found land in modern-day Canada, which was given the highly original name of Newfoundland. He set off for a second voyage a year later in 1498, with a fleet of 5 ships, but the fleet was struck by a storm and Cabot was lost at sea. A decade later, John Cabot's son, Sebastian Cabot, took up his father's mantra. He took a similar route to his father in 1508, and he explored and charted the eastern coast of Canada in greater detail, including the entrance to Hudson Bay. This discovery of modern-day Canada could have heralded a new age of exploration and empire. However, Henry VIII held very little interest in New World exploration. He would much rather explore lands much closer to home, namely the northern territories of France. Let's return to the overarching question of how successful was Henry VII at managing trade. Firstly, it is important to remember that England did not have well-established trade routes. Unlike the Republic of Venice or the Hanseatic League, England did not have a diverse trade, either, since 90% of exports were in the wool or cloth trade. Nonetheless, Henry sought to boost trade through the Navigation Acts that prioritized English merchants and their ships. Henry had some success when he introduced a popular trade deal called Magnus Intercursus in 1496 with Burgundy. This was a deal that favored both English and Flemish merchants. However, Henry was too greedy in 1506 when he coerced Philip of Burgundy into a bad trade deal, as part of the Treaty of Windsor. This was dubbed Melos Intercursus, or the Bad Treaty. This was short-lived as it was not put into action before Philip of Burgundy unexpectedly died. Finally, Henry had some success with his investment in New World exploration through the 2 expeditions of John Cabot, who discovered Newfoundland. This meant the fishing industry in Bristol gained a boost. However, his second voyage was a disaster and he was lost at sea. John Cabot's son, Sebastian, picked up his father's mantra in 1508, but by the time he returned, the old king had died and the new king had no interest in New World exploration. Therefore, it is fair to say, the success of New World exploration was limited. Thank you for listening. Tune into the seminar to learn how to apply your understanding on foreign policy to an exam-style question.